The first sign something was wrong wasn't the crowd. It was the string quartet playing in my backyard before I'd even finished my morning coffee. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd walked onto the wrong property. Then I saw my old maple tree wrapped in white lights, folding tables covering the garden my late wife had planted 20 years earlier, and a giant banner hanging between two branches that read Cedar Ridge Community Appreciation Gala. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. Someone had actually decided my land belonged to them. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 62 years old, and I've lived on the same 5-acre property outside Prescott, Arizona, since Ronald Reagan was in office, long before the luxury homes arrived, before the gated entrance, before the fancy clubhouse and imported palm trees. This valley was nothing but ranches, dirt roads, and neighbors who settled disagreements with a handshake instead of lawyers. I stayed because this place wasn't just land to me. It was every birthday my daughters celebrated under those trees, every anniversary dinner on the porch, every memory of my wife laughing while trying to convince wildflowers to grow where everyone else said they couldn't. Then the developers showed up, carved the surrounding land into 50 expensive homes, formed an HOA, and suddenly I became the odd old man whose property didn't match the neighborhood brochure. They offered to buy me out 3 separate times. The first offer was polite, the second was persistent, and the third came with a smile that felt more like a warning than a business proposal. I turned them all down because some things aren't for sale. Apparently that answer offended the HOA president, Melissa Drake, a woman who believed every problem in the neighborhood could be solved with enough confidence and someone else's money. We'd crossed paths plenty of times over the years. She complained that my antique pickup lowered property values, that my vegetable garden looked too rustic, that my old red barn didn't fit the community aesthetic. Every conversation ended the same way. She'd smile, tell me I'd regret refusing to cooperate, then drive away in a spotless luxury SUV without looking back. I figured she'd eventually move on to bothering someone else. I was wrong. That Saturday morning proved she'd been planning something much bigger. 2 catering trucks blocked my driveway. Landscapers I'd never hired were trimming hedges I'd intentionally let grow naturally. Electricians were running extension cords across my lawn while workers unloaded hundreds of white chairs like they owned the place. One young man carrying flower arrangements actually apologized when he nearly bumped into me. "Sorry, sir," he said. "We're running behind schedule. The event starts at 4. I looked at him and asked the only question that made sense. "Whose event?" He blinked. "The HOA gala, sir." I laughed because it sounded ridiculous, until I realized nobody else was laughing. I pulled out my phone and called Melissa. She answered on the second ring, sounding strangely cheerful. "Good morning, Daniel. Why are there 200 people setting up a party in my backyard?" There was a brief pause. Then she sighed, as if I were the inconvenience. "The board approved temporary use of that green space for the benefit of the community." "Green space?" I said. "Melissa, you're standing on private property." "Well," she replied, "our attorney believes the situation is a little more complicated than that." Before I could answer, she hung up. I stood there staring at the phone, trying to decide whether I was angry or simply amazed by the level of arrogance it took to say something like that out loud. My next stop wasn't the sheriff's office. It was the dusty filing cabinet in my workshop where my father had kept every survey, deed, and easement dating back more than 60 years. God, Dad used to tell me, never throw away old paperwork. Land remembers everything, even when people don't. At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. That morning, I finally understood what he meant. As I spread faded maps across the workbench, one document caught my eye. An agreement signed decades before the subdivision ever existed, complete with engineering diagrams and handwritten notes in my grandfather's careful script. I read it once, then twice, and slowly leaned back in my chair as something I'd nearly forgotten came rushing back. The people outside believed they controlled the neighborhood because they managed the streets and collected monthly dues. What they didn't know was that the most important piece of infrastructure, serving every single home, had never belonged to the developer in the first place. It belonged to my family. And by the time Melissa welcomed her guests that afternoon, she was about to discover exactly what that meant. I didn't rush outside with a grin or start making threats because that's never been my style. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and watched expensive decorations slowly transform my backyard into something that looked like a wedding venue. Workers carried crystal centerpieces across the same patch of grass where my daughters used to play softball. A florist apologized for driving stakes through my irrigation lines because she'd been told the property belonged to the HOA. and every apology somehow made the situation even more unbelievable. None of those people were my enemies. They were just doing the job someone else had hired them to do. Melissa, on the other hand, knew exactly what she was doing. Around noon, she finally arrived wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, sunglasses perched on her head like she was about to host a charity fundraiser instead of trespassing on private property. She spotted me sitting on the porch and walked over with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. "Daniel," she called with an almost rehearsed smile, "isn't this going to be wonderful for the community?" I looked around at the flower beds that had been flattened beneath rolling equipment and then back at her. "You destroyed my landscaping, blocked my driveway, and invited 200 people onto my property without asking. Explain to me how any of that sounds wonderful." She folded her arms. "The board voted unanimously. Our attorney reviewed everything." I couldn't help smiling a little. "Did your attorney review the engineering records from 1979? The smile disappeared from her face for half a second before returning. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I know," I said quietly. "That's the problem." She rolled her eyes and walked away before I could say anything else. By 3 o'clock, luxury SUVs filled the temporary parking area along the neighborhood streets. Couples climbed out wearing tailored suits, cocktail dresses, polished shoes that had clearly never touched dirt, and every few seconds another guest wandered across my lawn complimenting the decorations without realizing they were standing in someone else's backyard. I heard one man say, "This is the perfect community. Everything is so well organized." I almost laughed, if only he knew. Hidden beneath that perfectly trimmed lawn sat a decades-old utility corridor, unlike anything the new residents imagined. Long before the subdivision existed, the original county approved a centralized wastewater transfer system because the terrain made individual systems impractical. The developer who eventually built Cedar Ridge negotiated a permanent operating agreement with my father because the only practical route crossed our land. They installed lift pumps, inspection access, emergency controls, and a mechanical transfer station inside a small concrete building tucked behind my old barn. Ownership of the equipment inside that building never transferred to the HOA, never transferred to the developer's successors, and never transferred to the county. Maintenance remained the responsibility of my family, a clause so old that most people assumed it had become irrelevant. It hadn't. Every shower, every washing machine, every dishwasher, every toilet in 50 expensive homes quietly depended on equipment sitting less than 100 feet behind my garage. I wasn't planning to damage anything. I simply intended to suspend non-emergency operation until unauthorized access to my property ended and legal responsibilities could be clarified. I called the county utility engineer, explained exactly what was happening, documented the trespass with photographs, emailed copies of the deed, and received the answer I already expected. "Mr. Mercer," the engineer said, "as long as you're following emergency procedures and not intentionally damaging the infrastructure, you're operating within your maintenance authority." That was all I needed to hear. At 1:15, I walked into the equipment building, completed the required shutdown sequence exactly as outlined in the maintenance manual my father had handed me decades earlier, logged the time in the inspection notebook, and locked the door behind me. Then I returned to the porch. Nothing happened immediately. Of course it didn't. Systems like that never fail instantly. They fail slowly. Pressure builds gradually, and warning signs appear long before people understand what they're seeing. Around 2 o'clock, I noticed the first inspection vent beginning to gurgle. A groundskeeper frowned at the damp patch forming nearby but assumed a sprinkler line had broken. At 2:30, several guests commented on an unpleasant smell drifting across the lawn. Someone blamed fertilizer, another guessed a nearby ranch. The catering manager sprayed air freshener near the buffet tables and continued arranging silver trays of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and tiny desserts that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. By 3 o'clock, Melissa stood on the temporary stage welcoming everyone to another wonderful year of community growth and harmony. I almost admired the timing, as applause echoed across the yard. A bubbling sound rose from beneath the grass near the decorative fountain they'd installed that morning. A little boy tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, why is the ground moving?" His father barely looked down before answering. "Probably irrigation." Then the bubbling became louder. Wet patches spread across the lawn in several different places at once. Guests stepped backward, confused more than frightened. The smell changed first. No longer faint, no longer easy to ignore. Conversation slowed. People wrinkled their noses. One woman covered her mouth with a silk napkin, Another guest jokes that somebody should call a plumber. I quietly sipped my coffee. Then everything happened at once. Brown water pushed through the saturated ground near the center aisle where guests had been walking moments earlier. Expensive shoes disappeared into mud that definitely wasn't mud. Someone screamed. Another person slipped trying to run and landed flat on his back, splattering several nearby guests who instantly realized what they were standing in. Chairs toppled. Servers abandoned trays. A violinist stopped playing in the middle of a song before lifting her instrument above her head and sprinting toward the sidewalk. The smell rolled across the property like a wave, and panic replaced confusion almost instantly. Parents grabbed children without caring about handbags or jackets. 2 photographers climbed onto catering tables to protect thousands of dollars worth of equipment. One bartender simply stared at the overflowing lawn before whispering, "You've got to be kidding me." The DJ unplugged his speaker so quickly that half the cables remained scattered across the ground. Melissa, meanwhile, stood frozen near the stage, trying desperately to convince people everything was under control even as the carefully planned gala dissolved into complete chaos around her. And then she looked toward my porch, and for the first time all afternoon, our eyes met. She finally understood that the old man she'd dismissed as an obstacle had known exactly what would happen long before the first guest arrived. Melissa crossed my yard faster than I'd ever seen her move, stopping just short of the porch because by then, even she wasn't willing to step through what was left of her gala. Her expensive shoes were ruined, mascara streaked down one cheek, and the confidence she'd carried all afternoon had disappeared somewhere between the first scream and the last guest racing for the parking lot. "What did you do?" she shouted. I stood up slowly, set my coffee mug on the porch railing, and answered as calmly as I could. "I perform scheduled maintenance on equipment my family owns." She stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. "You sabotaged this event." I shook my head. "No, Melissa. You organized an event on private property without permission. There's a difference." Before she could interrupt, I walked back into my workshop and returned carrying a weathered binder. Inside were copies of the deed, the original engineering agreement, maintenance records dating back decades, photographs of the equipment building, inspection logs, and every letter exchanged with the developer long before the HOA even existed. I handed the binder to her. "Your attorney probably should have looked at these before he told you my land was community property." She flipped through a few pages before handing everything to another board member whose face grew noticeably paler with every document he read. 10 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, not because anyone had been arrested, but because half the guests were demanding answers. I showed the deputies my property survey, the county engineer's email, the maintenance log I completed before the shutdown, and photographs of the unauthorized event setup. One deputy quietly looked at Melissa and asked the question she'd been avoiding all day. "Did you have written permission from the property owner?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. The deputy sighed. "Ma'am, this appears to be a civil matter, but unauthorized use of private property isn't something we can ignore. I'd suggest everyone leave before this gets worse." By sunset, the tents were coming down. Catering trucks were loading untouched food back into coolers. Volunteers avoided making eye contact with me, and the same neighbors who'd watch across my lawn like they owned it were now carefully staying on the public sidewalk. 3 days later, I received a call from the HOA's outside attorney asking if I'd be willing to attend a special board meeting. I almost declined, but curiosity got the better of me. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse couldn't have been more different from our previous conversations. Melissa wasn't sitting at the head of the table anymore. She barely spoke. Their consulting engineer explained that relocating the wastewater transfer system would require tearing up multiple streets, obtaining new county permits, redesigning utility corridors, and spending well over $3 million. Even then, construction could take more than a year. They finally understood what my father had understood decades earlier. Some pieces of land aren't valuable because of what's growing on top of them. They're valuable because of everything quietly working underneath. Their attorney slid a proposed agreement across the table. I read every page before making a few changes of my own. The final contract established a monthly infrastructure maintenance fee, guaranteed that no HOA event, contractor, or volunteer could enter my property without my written approval, required 90 days' notice for any work near the easement, and obligated the association to restore any accidental damage immediately. They signed without arguing. A week later, a landscaping crew rebuilt every flower bed they'd destroyed, replaced damaged irrigation lines, repaired the stone walkway, and planted mature shrubs instead of cheap replacements. Melissa never apologized directly, but actions speak louder than speeches. 6 months later, she quietly resigned from the board, and the new president introduced himself by knocking on my front door with nothing more than a pie baked by his wife and a simple sentence I'll probably never forget. "We'd rather have a good neighbor than another lawsuit." That made me smile more than winning ever could. These days, the monthly payment arrives on time, the equipment gets serviced exactly as scheduled, and the neighborhood is surprisingly peaceful. Sometimes I'll see kids riding bicycles past my fence, and they'll wave because, unlike the adults who started all this, they don't care who owns what. They just see an old man watering tomatoes in his garden. Looking back, I don't think the real lesson was about legal documents or property rights. It was about respect. People become dangerous when they convince themselves that someone else's boundaries don't matter simply because they have more votes, more money, or louder voices. But every now and then reality reminds them that ownership isn't decided by confidence. It's decided by facts. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by letting the HOA learn that lesson the hard way? Or did they bring every bit of it on themselves the moment they treated private property like a public park? Let me know down in the comments because I read every single one. And if you've ever had a neighbor or an HOA cross a line they never should have crossed, I'd love to hear how you handled it.